David Kennedy is a professor of history emeritus at Stanford University and one of the world experts on President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. David, you got your BA here at Stanford in history and then your PhD in American Studies at Yale. And in the year 2000, you won a Pulitzer Prize for history for your excellent book, Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. So you are pretty much the best person in the world to talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt. And my first question is, where do you think he stands in the pantheon of American presidents, if we look at Lincoln and Washington and the others? Whereabouts is FDR, would you say?
Well, my opinion or my answer to that question about Roosevelt's standing in the pantheon of American presidents is not idiosyncratic with me. He repeatedly shows up as the number one or two or three, ranked one or two or three as the most consequential American presidents. And I think, I often tell students that there are three moments in American history when, if you understand their character and their depth, you understand a lot about the whole trajectory of this society through time. And one is the Revolutionary and Constitutional moment. The second is the Civil War and Reconstruction moment. And the third is the Great Depression and World War II moment. All three of those episodes, turns out, not coincidentally, each embraced a armed conflict as well as great upheaval at home. The basic character, you might even say trajectory of the society's development was deeply inflected. And it's not surprising, given the consequence of those three moments, that the presidents who presided over each of them, respectively, show up repeatedly in these polls of historians and others as the most consequential presidents. So it's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And we could probably quarrel at some length or debate at some length how to rank those three, but those three always show up consistently as among the most important. And they were also, I hesitate to put the discussion onto this plane, but they were also not only consequential, but they were people of character. They were people of admirable human qualities. And I think they by and large led the country in a positive way. They did not trade on the politics of hatred and resentment the way some other national leaders have done here and elsewhere. But they were, again, not to put too fine a point on it, visionaries about the country's future. And I often argue with people. This argument has now gotten a little stale, frankly. But there was a view of Franklin Roosevelt that prevailed in some quarters for a long time, that he was an experimentalist and a pragmatist, that he tried this and that and the other thing, and whatever stuck to the wall became his policies. I think that's a view of him that is fundamentally mistaken. I think he had a vision, I use that word advisedly, of where he wanted to take American society, and you can find that vision articulated fairly well in his correspondence with his political associates and intimates and others in the 1920s before he became president. And he wanted a society in which there was more security. And it's no accident the word security appears in the single most durable and consequential piece of legislation from that period, the Social Security Act. And indeed, he presided over a lot of measures, the passage of a lot of measures that reduced risk in American life, in risk of unemployment, risks associated with old age, risks associated with investing, risks associated with home ownership, and so on and so on. And he succeeded largely in taking the society in that direction and creating a society in which was more inclusive and less risky for a lot of people. He said something at one point, I can't quote it exactly, but I can paraphrase it pretty well. Something about he wanted to build a society in which no one was left out. And that's a pretty fundamental idea for any leader to embrace, and I think he largely succeeded. And then if we turn to the international scene, again, the record is more muddled here because he was less articulate about this, but the war over which he presided as the American president created a world that was less risky. There's been no Grande Guerre for 3 generations after World War II, a whole set of new institutions that tried to bring a measure of order to the international system. These two are legacies of his leadership, and I think it's quite legitimate and justified that he has this ranking as one of the 3 most consequential American presidents.
And another way to rebut this idea that it was unplanned and he was experimental were the first 100 days in office, weren't they? Where he brought in an extraordinary blizzard of new organisations and institutions.
Well, I might argue with you on that point, Andrew. If there's any moment in his presidency when the accusation of experimentalism and pragmatism might have some traction, it's that 100 days. But there's a particular context there, because the urgent question at that moment in the spring of 1933 was to counterpunch to the Depression, which it was at its absolute nadir at that point. 13 million people, 25% of the workforce, unemployed, banks closed, so on and so forth. Now, the idea was common that the entire economic system was fatally wounded and it might never recover. So there was, and no one understood the causes of the Great Depression. As a matter of fact, people to this day debate what exactly drove that great economic calamity. And John Maynard Keynes had not yet published his great work, tried to analyze that matter. That was several years later. So there was a lot of haphazard and eclectic experimenting, let's say, in that first 100 days. But the real consequential moment comes a year or two later, 1935 in particular, which in some ways is the annus mirabilis of the New Deal and of Roosevelt's domestic legacy. When we see the Social Security Act passed, the full employment bill, so on and so forth. So it takes a while for Roosevelt to really get past the urgent task of combating the Depression and down to what I think in his mind was the more serious task of leaving a legacy of institutional change that really altered the landscape of American society and the American economy.
Did he save America from communism? If it had gone wrong, if the Great Depression had got worse, if his actions hadn't helped create the uplift, how bad could it have got?
Well, again, I'd tweak your question a little. Not only save the country from the possibility of communism, but the equal danger of fascism. And in fact, if you remember the famous open letter that John Maynard Keynes wrote to Roosevelt at the onset of his administration in 1933, again, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting exactly, but Keynes said something to the effect that if Roosevelt did not prove to be a successful champion of rational and deliberate liberal reform, the path would be open to extreme measures of another sort entirely. And he had in mind quite clearly either Bolshevism, communism, or fascism or Nazism. So those were quite different, but also twin dangers, you might say, if the whole liberal democratic order proved unable to recover from the Depression and really set the society on a more stable path.
And you had populists who were waiting in the wings, didn't you? Huey Long might have been one. That you could probably name some others.
Yes, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, I suppose, would be yet another. And there were German Bunds and brown shirts in the United States. My own view, frankly, is that the idea that any of those people were imminently capable of pushing the country into a fascist or a communist pathway have been greatly exaggerated. In fact, one of the remarkable things that I discovered when I first started researching freedom from fear was something that Roosevelt remarked on the campaign trail in 1932. And I found plenty of contemporary evidence to support this. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect that this country is now facing the greatest challenge to its institutions and its stability since the Civil War, and yet the American people remain passive. They're not flooding into the piazzas of the country and demanding some kind of radical change. They're grimly accepting this without really organizing any deliberately focused alternative. And that struck me. And again, I found plenty of evidence to support that observation at the time. So it was in 1933, the depths of the Depression, the best evidence we have is the American people were not psychologically on the precipice of being wooed by some kind of man on a white horse leader, whether he took the direction to the left or the right. So when Sinclair Lewis wrote that famous book, It Can't Happen Here, and later Philip Roth wrote a book many years later, kind of the same effect. I read them both as hugely exaggerated, kind of almost operatic exaggerations of the real possibility of the United States going fascist in the 1930s. That there were voices who had that tenor, that flavor, yes, no question about it. But the best granular study, particularly of the Long and Coughlin movements by now deceased Alan Brinkley, a book published some years ago, he proved to me conclusively that both of them commanded the most support when they were perceived as being aligned with Franklin Roosevelt. And to the extent that they were perceived as deviating from the direction that Roosevelt was trying to take the country, they lost support. So I just resist the idea that we were almost there and Roosevelt snatched us back from the brink.
He was an American aristocrat, wasn't he, by background? Had a strong sense of noblesse oblige. What drove him?
Well, again, it's a simple answer, I think, of what drove Roosevelt. This may sound kind of corny, but I think it captures something essential. He loved his country. People often ask me, particularly young people today in their cynical mood, say, why would anybody want to go into public life or be a political leader or whatever kind? I say, I think there's a simple answer to that. If you love your country, you want to serve that way. And I think he had a lot of that deeply internalized in his family. You called it noblesse oblige. I called it a little bit different term, but same ideas. An attitude of seniorial solicitude for his country. It's just, I think it was deep in his DNA. I don't think there was some eureka or Paul on the road to Damascus moment. It's just the way he'd been raised and his family tradition of public service. And his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had, I think, a lot of the same cultural orientation or political attitude. And we know that Franklin admired Theodore, even though they're from different parties and different political parties and different branches of the Roosevelt family. So again, in our cynical age, it's maybe hard to get our imaginations around the fact that someone would really devote himself lifelong to the improving the conditions of the society around him through political leadership. But I think it's as simple as that in the last analysis.
He came to power at much the same time as Adolf Hitler and died in the same month as Adolf Hitler. So it's worthwhile asking about his fight against American isolationism and the America First movement and Lindbergh and so on. To what extent was that something that developed over time, or was it something that he saw as being a sort of central, unwavering part of his political being?
Well, again, I think Roosevelt's record as an internationalist and as a proponent of a different role for the United States in the international system, and indeed a different architecture for the system as a whole, it's mixed in its evolutionary development. He starts out as an assistant secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. And Wilson, of course, is in some ways the defining, iconic American leader who first seriously proposed a pathway for the United States to play a more active international role. A lot of controversy about exactly what the character of that proposition was, but there he is. But in his first inaugural address in 1933, Roosevelt essentially said, for the moment, international relations do not concern us because we have such serious problems here at home. And that's often been seized on by people who think that he, at that moment, had repudiated any kind of internationalist position. But I think it was a matter of priorities that, exactly as he said, is for the moment, we must concentrate on matters at home. But he wasn't abandoning the Wilsonian vision of a more active international role for this country. And indeed, as the situation globally gets worse through the 1930s with Japanese incursions in China and rearmament of Nazi Germany and war in Ethiopia, Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and so on, he begins a process, you can date it roughly from 1935. Again, I think it's a master class that he offers in presidential leadership, trying to convince a largely isolationist public whose isolationism had in some ways been reinforced by disillusionment with the results of American intervention in World War I, he begins a years-long effort to educate the public at large about the necessity and the legitimacy of the United States playing a more active international role. And he hits some roadblocks along the way. It doesn't succeed right away at all. And it takes a succession of events in the international system itself, not least of all more Japanese aggression in Asia, the fall of France in particular in 1940, but also this consistent years-long effort on Roosevelt's part to educate the public about the need for this country to put its weight in the scales to bring some measure of order and legitimacy to the international system.
And when in December 1941, the Germans declare war on America, days after the Japanese have attacked America, one might have thought that the United States, the natural thing would be to deal with the people who actually had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. But instead, the Roosevelt administration adopts the Germany first policy and puts by far the greater amount of troops into the West rather than the East, which I've always thought of as the greatest act of statesmanship of the 20th century, to adopt this Clausewitzian concept of taking out the more powerful of the two enemies. Yeah. Would you go along with that?
Absolutely, yes. Roosevelt himself, again, in his usual homely way, quite succinctly put this great strategic principle as follows. He said, the defeat of Germany will mean the defeat of Japan, but the defeat of Japan will not mean the defeat of Germany. The Japanese aggression in Asia was in many ways parasitic on the disruption of the European system, especially the colonial powers in Asia were hugely distracted and diminished in their capacity to control events in Asia. And Roosevelt agreed from the outset with the idea, or he himself put forward the idea, that Germany was the number one strategic adversary and had to be dealt with first. There's an interesting byplay to this that comes up in some of these discussions. In Churchill's memoir, I forget exactly where, but Churchill describes for the reader his state of mind when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941. And Churchill writes something like, so the United States was in, after all, into the neck and into the death, good Churchillian rhetoric. And so I went to bed as England would survive, Britain would survive, and I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. Well, strategically, that's an accurate description of Churchill's great objective, is to bring the United States into the conflict at the side of Britain, no question. But as a description of what Churchill actually did in December 1941, it's inaccurate, because the first thing he did essentially was get himself to Washington, D.C. as fast as he could, lived in the White House for a period of 2 weeks, I think, in December of 1941, to make sure that the Americans were going to honor the Germany first principle. And he sensed, as you just suggested, Andrew, that it was possible, imaginable, that the insult of the blow at Pearl Harbor and the thirst for revenge against Japan might be so overwhelming that the Roosevelt administration would hound off into the Pacific in a war of vengeance against the Japanese and abandon the Germany first principle. But Roosevelt, again, and I give him credit here for what you just described as one of the great strategic decisions of the century, he was steadfast in his vision and a great strategic premise that Germany was the principal adversary and that we were not going to commit resources to the Pacific War that would distract from the European theater. Now, that changes a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, after the Battle of Midway, a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack, when the American forces sank a majority of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet in a single day. And that opened the possibility of a more, what should I say, forward, expeditionary, aggressive war in the Pacific on the United States part. So there was a slight revision of the original plan. And the original idea was to devote something on the order of 90% of American resources to the European theater and 10% on a purely defensive war in the Pacific. After Midway, that changes to 70% Europe, 30% Pacific. But the United States turned out to have such depth of resources that even that recalculation left a lot of material, both human and otherwise, for the principal theater of war, which was the European theater.
Tell us about the personal relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. As you say, he, after sleeping the night, that night, the sleep of the saved and the thankful, he did go out to DC and started a. Well, they'd already met, of course, twice before, but this was the real time when they got to know one another properly. What was the relationship like?
Well, I think it was cordial, but also somewhat cautious, especially on Roosevelt's side. And again, I think there's a lot of mythologizing about just how boon companionable the two of them were. They certainly got along in ways that are maybe a little bit remarkable in the annals of great state relations. But both were also quite calculating. And one interesting question that I tried to pursue a bit when I wrote about this, never fully resolved, is at what point does it become clear that Roosevelt, not Churchill, is the senior partner? And I think Churchill is probably the senior partner up through the moment of the Casablanca conference when the unconditional surrender formula is declared and the invasion of Italy is agreed. And after that, Roosevelt becomes the superior partner. So,
well, Churchill doesn't even know about the unconditional surrender until FDR brings it out in the Casablanca conference. I mean, that's quite a key moment of sort of power play between the two, isn't it?
I agree. And in some ways, you can regard the unconditional surrender statement as a kind of a consolation prize for Stalin, now that the invasion of Italy has been agreed thanks to Churchill's dominance in the relationship. And the great worry was that the Soviets might either collapse under the Wehrmacht's pressure in the Soviet Union or be so badly bloody that they would seek a negotiated settlement and leave the war. And that would make the whole situation of the Anglo-American alliance much more dire. So there's another interesting moment. Go back to Pearl Harbor, when Churchill is preparing to come to Washington, D.C., and he tells somebody, it might have been Alexander Cadogan, a Foreign Office person, I can't remember to whom he was talking, but he said something to the effect, I'm going to go to Washington and make sure that those bloody Americans stick to their Germany first premise. And whoever his interlocutor was said something like, well, isn't that a little harsh to speak to them that way? And you've been speaking to them so kindly and solicitously up till now. And he says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but I can quote this pretty exactly. He said, well, that's the way we talked to them when we were wooing them. Now that they're in the harem, we don't need to do that anymore. So Churchill, he had his own calculating attitude about how to deal with the Americans. And again, on Roosevelt's side, Roosevelt was always, I think, somewhat wary. When they get to the first Big Three meeting at Tehran in 1943, Roosevelt's very first initiative is to have a private meeting with Stalin and exclude Churchill. And he deliberately kept Churchill out of that conversation. Churchill was quite upset about that. But again, it's part of Roosevelt's determination, especially at that moment in 1943, to be the creature of Churchill's strategic desires and to assert his own.
And by 1943, it's very clear that the United States is the arsenal of democracy, that the amount of sheer war material that is being poured out is hugely superior to that of the British Empire. And this obviously gives FDR the final say in things like the final decision over when to launch the cross-channel attack.
Yes, again, as you well know, Churchill, for understandable reasons, was very nervous about the possibility of success of the cross-channel attack. There had been, he of course remembered the fate of the British Army when it confronted the Kaiser's German army at Passchendaele and so on. He remembered Gallipoli and the Dieppe raid. Churchill was understandably very, very worried that an amphibious invasion across the Channel would not succeed and result in the kind of bloodshed that he witnessed in World War I. And again, this reflects or illustrates a long-standing strategic debate between the British and the American military Eisenhower, in his diary, when the decision was made to invade North Africa, Eisenhower says in 1942, Eisenhower wrote something like, "This is the blackest day in the history of the American military, because we're going to divert forces to a peripheral theater, Africa, which has no real bearing on the event of the standing power of the Germans in their strategic heartland and the continent of Europe itself." Italy had a lot of the same character. And in fact, the Americans would refer to these initiatives in North Africa and Italy as periphery pecking. And they thought this was the heart of Churchill's strategic concept of how to wage the war, where the Americans were impatient to wage war the way they'd all learned at West Point for the previous several generations, to build enough strength to take on the enemy's main strength and have one big decisive battle.
And yet FDR went along with Churchill and Alan Brooke rather than with Eisenhower and General Marshall.
Yes, because he really had no counterweight. The American force was still quite small. American military production was still just in its incipient stage. So he really did not have the resources to effectively counter Churchill's strategic priorities. But by 1943, certainly by 1944, he assuredly did.
Yes, absolutely, by 1944. But in 1943, you hadn't won the Battle of the Atlantic, and to launch a cross-channel attack without being able to resupply would have been possibly suicidal in France.
Yeah.
Yalta. By the time of the Yalta Conference, obviously FDR was ill and failing physically. How was he mentally?
Well, there's plenty of evidence that he was failing cognitively as well as physically well before the Yalta Conference. A lot of anecdotal evidence now well substantiated that at social gatherings, one kind, dinner parties, let's say, he would tell the same story 2, 3, 4 times in a row. I mean, the kind of signs of mental deterioration with which we're now, many of us, all too familiar in our own contemporaries. So yes, he was diminished at Yalta, and Yalta formalized certain arrangements that became politically highly controversial and mobilizable, especially by the Republican Party in this country after the war. And again, my own personal view is that Yalta was not all that consequential. The really important dispositive decisions were ratified not at Yalta, but at Tehran, well over a year earlier, and that those decisions in turn were a consequence of the way the United States mobilized for the war. And let me dilate on that just for a moment. Again, I'll try not to overburden you or your listeners with too much detail here, but a decision was made in 1943 to scale back both the timetable and the depth of American mobilization. And it was agreed that the original target of mobilizing 215 divisions would be scaled back to 90 divisions. This was called the 90 division gamble. Actually, this decision was made in October of 42, sorry, not 43. And to postpone the target date for D-Day from its original target of July 1, 1943, to what becomes, as we all know, June 6, 1944. So the United States made a very deliberate decision to betting on the fact that the Soviets would stay in the war. That's the premise of all this. That they could fight on a slower timetable and with a lesser degree of mobilization than originally anticipated. So what did that mean? It meant necessarily, it was an absolutely inevitable logical consequence of the decision to fight the war on this basis, that the Soviets were going to carry a lot of the burden of the military conflict, and that the Red Army, so-called, would be well into Central and Eastern Europe at the war's conclusion. So go back to Tehran, that meeting I mentioned just a moment ago, when the very first thing that Roosevelt does is have a meeting with Joseph Stalin, just the two of them and their two translators. And we have very good records of this meeting, almost verbatim records. The first thing that Roosevelt says to Churchill to Stalin, is, I know, again, I'm paraphrasing, I know that when this war ends, since you're bearing so much of the burden of fighting, you will be well into Eastern and Central Europe. and you'll be in control there. And that's just the logical consequence of the way we've decided to delay D-Day and mobilize a smaller force and so on and so forth. And that's going to be your territory. Again, I'm paraphrasing. That's going to be your territory, but I hope you'll at least do me the favor of making some gestures at establishing democratic governments. And he explicitly said, he said, I have a lot of Polish voters in Chicago, and they'll need to know that their other country's interests are being protected. It was a cynical proposition, but it was the logical and necessary consequence of the timetable and the scope and scale and depth of American mobilization. So it's clear by the time of Tehran in 1943 that this is going to be the case. So Yalta does nothing more essentially than officially recognize what were these consequences. So again, I've always thought that the focus on Yalta is mistaken. That the focus really ought to be, if you want to focus on a meeting, it should be on Tehran. And what happens at Tehran, again, is the logical consequence of the decision made in late 1942 to take the 90 Division gamble and keep a lot of the manpower that was originally targeted for conscription and mobilization deployment, keep them at home. So another consequence of this, and again, we could argue about the morality of it or the cynicism of it. But another consequence of this is that keeping 115 divisions of manpower at home that was originally destined to be in the battlefield meant that the American economy could not only build the great war machine that supplied itself and the Allies, but the American civilian sector of the economy grew during the war by, we think, 15%. That's not true of any other belligerent that fought the war for any length of time. The United States alone both created this gigantic military machine and also grew its civilian economy. And guess what? The strength and health of that economy is what put the United States in the position in 1945 of originating and proposing institutions that would work to change the whole structure of the international economy and statecraft.
So what you're saying essentially is that the revisionists who criticised FDR and also Churchill for essentially giving away the independence and integrity of places like Poland at Yalta, in fact, really this had already been agreed by the November of 1943 in the case of...
Absolutely. Tehran is the place where it's officially recognized.
And of course, in October 1944, with the percentages agreement that Churchill drew up with Stalin at the Kremlin in the October of 1944. The criticism, and that makes perfect sense to me, and it also seems that the agreements with regard to where troops would stop at the end of the war were agreed much earlier on, as early as 1943 in some cases. But so basically the critique of modern day critique of FDR coming from, and Churchill indeed, coming from the right, especially the revisionist right, people like Tucker Carlson and Darryl Cooper at the moment, who essentially try to put their own isolationist views, project them back into history, as it were, arguing that Churchill and Roosevelt made the war worse than it needed to have been, and also the criticisms that are made and have been made for decades now about how many communists there were in the State Department, and Alger Hiss going to Yalta, and Harry Dexter White and all of that kind of stuff. Basically, your response to that is it's ahistorical with regard to the isolationism, and it's irrelevant with regard to Yalta.
That's a terrifically good way to encapsulate my general argument. It's irrelevant with respect to Yalta and inconsequential with respect to the conduct of the war in general.
What about the less sort of, in my view, irresponsible critiques that have been made of FDR at this period? The number of Jews who were allowed to come into the United States before the Second World War. We too in Britain were keeping Jews out of Palestine, of course, in under the White Paper of 1939. What's your response to the critique of FDR over that?
Well, again, another terribly complicated matter, both in terms of historical policy and the record, and of course, our moral judgment about the people involved. That there were well-placed people in the in American policy apparatus who were anti-Semitic, no question about it. My own view is that the story would not look a lot different if you could somehow revisit that equation and remove the anti-Semitic factor altogether. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, the controlling legislation that Roosevelt had to work with in the 1924 National Origins Act, so-called, had no provision in it for refugees. The language is not there. Nobody had envisioned a refugee crisis on the scale that the Holocaust eventually starts to create. So there was no legal channel for him to really substantially change the law or use the law, let's say. That's number one. Number two, when the proposal was made to allow more refugees, especially from Germany and then Austria after the Anschluss, into the United States, unemployment was in this country was still running at the 17 and 18% rate. And again, any country with that degree of unemployment that is asked to allow more dependent refugees in would naturally hesitate. I mean, that's number two. Number three, and this is a difficult point, I think, for a lot of people to grasp. It's difficult for me to articulate even. But at this date in the 1930s, even in the late 1930s, no one knew what the full, god-awful, wholesale, industrial strength Holocaust was going to be. And indeed, a lot of German Jews couldn't understand, couldn't foresee what awaited them and their fellow Jews in the future, and refused to leave Germany. And the Holocaust is really visited mostly on people to the east of Germany. And that, again, in my view, it's impossible to separate the full industrial strength Holocaust after 1942 from the circumstances of the war. It's a product of the war, and there we are. Now, all that said, I go back, and I've tried to convey this in the classroom many times. It's a difficult point to make. I go back to the difficulty everybody had at that moment in just understanding the scale and depth and monstrosity of the moral crime that the Holocaust is and was. And there's a terrific moment. It's an anecdote, but it tells us volumes, I think, when this guy, Jan Karski, who's a Polish Gentile and a righteous person honored today at Yad Vashem, comes to the home of the Polish ambassador or government in exile in Washington, D.C., and tells Felix Frankfurter, arguably the most prominent Jew in the United States at that time, Supreme Court Justice, intimate friend of Franklin Roosevelt. He tells him what he's seen it was at the departure station for the Holocaust death camp in Belzec. And there's a recent play and movie with David Strathairn called Remember This, which dramatizes this moment, powerful moment. So Karski, who has come across the Atlantic and escaped from Nazi occupied Germany, he'd been a Polish diplomat. He was multilingual, but he was afraid his Polish accent might give him away when he spoke German as he was making his way through Nazi-occupied Europe. So he pulled a couple of his molars out so his face would swell to mask his accent. And that's how he got to the United States. And he tells the story, and there's this tremendously dramatic moment when Frankfurt, after he's heard Karski tell about what's happening in these death camps, and he says, "I cannot believe you." And the Polish ambassador says, "Mr. Justice Frankfurt, this young man has come here at great personal sacrifice and risk, nearly lost his life. He's mutilated himself to actually get here, and you cannot call him a liar." And a Frankfurter says, I did not call this young man a liar. I said, I cannot believe him. There is a difference. Well, that reminds us of something. Why do we have Holocaust memorials and museums and plays and movies and so on about it today? We still can't fully understand the depravity that made that monstrous crime happen. And contemporaries, again, let's make a distinction here between knowledge and understanding. They might have known some facts about it, but I think fully understanding just what they were looking at was difficult. Frankfurter, that response he gave to Karski, to me, makes the point. So that's all in the background, I think, to this whole question of Roosevelt and the Holocaust and the fate of European Jewry. And again, I think we need to make two important distinctions here. One is the phase of the pre-war phase, the 1930s, down to 1939, when the question is about refugees. And it turns out, in fact, the United States took in more refugees than any other country, about 150,000 all told. And then there's a second phase, a very distinct phase, that's wartime, when the question is then not about refugees, but about rescue. And let's remember that the death camps are deep in Central Europe, in Poland and Ukraine and so on. And we didn't land a troop on the main body of the European continent, Italy accepted, until 1944. And the war's over 11 months later. So neither this country nor any other Western country really had the means to conduct a large-scale rescue operation until the war's conclusion. So again, it's a complicated story. I don't want to be understood as making excuses for the Roosevelt administration. I think once they created the War Refugee Board in early 1944, the administration took some positive actions, particularly with respect to Hungarian Jews. They sponsored Raoul Wallenberg to go and hand out fake birth certificates and passports and so on. Cardinal Spellman broadcast into Hungary saying that any Catholic Hungarian who participated in the export of Jews to Auschwitz was committing mortal sin. So there were significant efforts, too late, you might say, to really have been consequential, but as circumstances permitted, it seems to me there were some positive efforts.
Another critique of his administration is, of course, the internment of the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. We in Britain interned a great deal of a large number of Germans and Austrians in the even though Churchill considered it in the highest degree odious, but considered it to be an absolute necessity on grounds of national security. What do you think is the sort of present day view of the Japanese internment?
Well, I think the present day view actually is consistent with the contemporary view of a lot of people. This was a shameful and odious and unconstitutional thing to do. And again, let's make a distinction between people who are designated as enemy aliens, that they are citizens of a country with which this or any other country is at war, and American citizens. And from the moment that executive order came down, people as consequential as Secretary of War Henry Stimson said, this is going to blow a great hole in our Constitution. And there was great discomfort and unease about it right from the beginning. When Milton Eisenhower was appointed the first director of the Japanese relocation program, he very quickly, within weeks or months, he said he couldn't sleep at night given the job that he had, and he gave it up, and he handed it to his successor, a man named Dillon, and he said, I hope you were able to deal with this. I can't take it any longer. So they're right from the beginning, a lot of people were disillusioned with this. That's a complicated story again, but I must say there are people in the American military, especially the general in charge of the West Coast Western Military District, a guy by the name of DeWitt. They deliberately falsified records to justify what they had done, and the evacuation order, so-called. So it remains a shameful episode. But to explain it simply on the grounds of some kind of reflexive anti-Japanese prejudice, I think it's just far too simple. It's a much more complicated story than that.
He was a good chooser of of people, wasn't he? FDR, a good delegator. He had a good eye for talented people. We've already mentioned Frankfurter and Marshall and Eisenhower, but one might add Harold Ickes and Brandeis and others. You know, he was somebody who could spot a talented person to delegate to. Is that a fair appreciation of him?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And again, another index of that, or a way to kind of confirm your instinct about it, is to think of the people that stayed in his cabinet for long periods of time. Again, unlike a lot of recent administrations, both parties, there was not a big shuffle of people. Harold Ickes was there the entire time at Interior. Henry Morgenthau at the Treasury was there through the whole thing. Secretary of Labor was there through the whole administration. So, yes, I think he chose wisely. His associates and subordinates supported them, and they reciprocated by giving loyal service over a decade and more, which is quite unusual in the annals of American public service at that level.
How important was Eleanor in his administration as opposed to his life, or both, actually? Why not?
Well, his administration and his life were hardly separate matters, but
Yeah.
in fact, it was said of him, of Roosevelt, that his conception of the presidency, when he thought about it in some conceptual or abstract way, was an image of himself in it. So there's no question that Eleanor was in some ways had a more sensitive social conscience than he did, and was more outspoken about a lot of things having to do, especially with race relations, than he felt comfortable doing publicly. It remains a bit of a mystery whether in private he shared her views entirely or not. But she's on the public record as a more sensitive moral conscience than he was about a lot of matters. That said, and go back to the distinction you made between his life and his administration, there's less really compelling evidence about how often or how effectively she really shaped the course of policy. It's not zero, that calculation is not zero, but I'm not sure exactly what value to put on it. But yeah, she was an extraordinary person in her own right. They just can't argue with that. She's not just a first lady; she's just in her own person, her own right, a consequential historical figure.
And his polio, his disability, how important was that?
Well, again, he's stricken with polio when he's in his 30s, early 1920s. I go back to an aperçu or an obiter dictum, whatever, an observation of William James, the great philosopher and the father of the discipline of psychology in this country. And he said something to the effect that every man's, he said man, could have said person, every person's character is cast in plaster by the age of 30. Now, modern day psychologists and geneticists and so on probably push that date way further back. The Jesuits used to say that if they could educate a boy beginning at age 7, they could control his development to manhood. Freud and people like Steven Pinker today think it's all happens in utero, and we're hardwired in certain ways before we ever even take our first breath. So, though a lot of people have tried to make something out of Roosevelt's episode with polio as changing his essential character, I don't think that's the case. I think his essential character was established well before that. It was a trial he overcame. I don't think it somehow made a different person out of him. It just demonstrated the depth and resolve of the character he already had.
Yes, his sort of inner resilience was something that was already there. Yeah, that makes sense. What history book or biography are you reading at the moment,
Well,
David?
Andrew, it will probably come as no surprise to you because I have a hunch that you have the same bad habit, that I'm reading several things simultaneously.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
It is. I lack the discipline to finish one before I start the other.
All right. Well, you're not allowed to have too many. Give us two. What are you reading
Well,
at the
I
moment?
did just finish Hal Brand's book, What Use is Grand Strategy, which is it consists of 4 case studies of administrations beginning with Truman and through Reagan and Bush even, and what grand strategic architecture they use to drive policy or control policy. A very granular study of those 4 episodes, and one that's very thought-provoking about what do we mean by grand strategy? Is it really dispositive or just notional? So I found that a very interesting read. I'm reading a book by a Brit, Jonathan Sumption, a jurist and political philosopher of sorts, about the character of mass democracy. I find that very provocative. He has some very almost heretical things to say. He raises the prospect, which I've raised more cautiously in other contexts, very, very unorthodox question. Is there such a thing as too much democracy? That democracy, the excesses of democracy can be highly consequential for the problems of democracy. So I'm reading those 2. Now I'm about to start Robert Mary's biography of President James Polk. So that's what's on my list right now. I'll tell you, but I want to take the opportunity to insert something here. Probably the most interesting, thought-provoking, and well-crafted work of history that I've read in recent years, I read this a couple of years ago now, but it just came up again in another context, is a book by a historian at NYU, Nicole Eustace. The book is called Covered with Night, and it's about a murder on the Pennsylvania frontier in the early 18th century. And the book is about how Native peoples and the British colonial authorities brought to this situation 2 completely different concepts of justice as they tried to deal with the perpetrators. There's no question of who the perpetrators were and that they committed the murder. The British wanted to assert their sovereign authority by trying and executing these people, and the Native peoples said, that's not our conception of justice. We want to get those murderers reintegrated into the community in a productive way. Wholly different concepts of what they meant by justice. It's a beautifully written book, and it's one of the most impactful, thought-provoking things I've read in recent years.
Covered by Night.
Covered with night, I think, is
with night. With night.
And that phrase comes from the Indian expression for what happened to the community when a murder was committed, that the community was covered with darkness.
Tell me about your what if, your counterfactual.
Well, probably my favorite what if goes back to something we were discussing a little bit earlier, and it is the American decision, and it was a decision in very late 1941, November, as late as November 1941, just days before Pearl Harbor, not to seek a so-called modus vivendi or some kind of stand down with the Japanese. This was an active proposal. Some very consequential, well-situated people like Joseph Grew, the U.S. ambassador in Tokyo, proposed it. And Roosevelt seriously entertained it as late as the last week of November 1941, that we would resume certain critical shipments to Japan in return for a promise by the Japanese to undertake no further aggression outside of China. But they wanted a free hand in China. And that was the thing we finally couldn't accept. But thinking through the consequences, had the United States and Japan reached some kind of a trucial settlement in late 1941, no Pearl Harbor, no Pacific War, 100% of American resources devoted to the European theater, 100%.
But Hitler doesn't declare war on America on the 11th of December 1941, absent Pearl Harbor?
Well, again, why Hitler did that, as you well know, remains something of a mystery. Several people have addressed that question without, to me, coming up with a satisfactory answer. But whether he did that or not, the United States could then devote all of its resources to the European theater if there's no Japanese or Pacific War. And think of the consequences of that. Then it's conceivable that the original timetable for D-Day might have held, July of 1943, by which time the Red Army is not yet into Poland, or barely into Poland. So then the history of post-war Europe looks very, very different. And then Germany defeated. Then the United States and Britain, let's say, and maybe even the Soviet Union, turn their attention to the Japanese theater and impose their will on the Japanese at that point when they have overwhelming strength. So you get a wholly different end of war scenario, and then you get a wholly different initial period of the so-called Cold War. And the Tehran and the Yalta agreements look like it would never have happened.
Yeah, so it all comes down to that oil embargo that FDR slapped on Japan. Good. Well, I hope that you're right that FDR could have defeated isolationism sometime at that point from November 1941 onwards.
I think he already had when he got passage of the Lend-Lease Act in the spring of 1941.
There's a huge difference between giving us arms and sending millions of Americans abroad, though, surely.
It was a $7 billion appropriation. That's larger than every single one of the New Deal budgets, with one single exception. Hitler said this is tantamount to a declaration of war, and he was right.
And Churchill called it the most unsordid act, which it most certainly was. Thank you very much indeed, David Kennedy, for appearing on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you, Andrew. Always a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, David. My next guest on Secrets of Statecraft is Richard Horowitz, the publisher of the Octavian Report and author of In the Garden of the Righteous, the heroes who risked their lives during the Holocaust.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.